Most people think relationships end the day someone walks away. They remember the final conversation, the silence that followed, the empty room, the absence that suddenly became impossible to ignore. That moment feels so sharp that it convinces you it must have been the beginning of the ending. But it wasn't. By the time someone leaves physically, the real departure has usually been happening for weeks, months, sometimes even years. The body simply arrives late to a decision the mind already made. That's why the goodbye never matches the pain. The goodbye is only an announcement. The real loss happened quietly, while everything still looked normal. The most disturbing part is that you can live beside someone who has already left you emotionally without realizing it. Nothing dramatic has to happen. They still wake up next to you. They still laugh at familiar moments. They still remember your favorite meal. They still ask how your day was. From the outside, everything appears untouched. Even you begin convincing yourself that the strange distance you're feeling is temporary, that stress is responsible, that life has simply become complicated. But deep inside, another part of you notices something impossible to describe. You begin missing someone who is still standing right in front of you. That feeling is one of the cruelest psychological experiences a person can endure because there is no obvious wound to point at. Nobody has betrayed you. Nobody has disappeared. Nobody has admitted that anything has changed. Instead, you're left trying to explain an invisible absence. You don't feel abandoned, yet you somehow feel alone. You don't feel rejected, yet you begin questioning your own worth. The relationship hasn't ended, but the warmth that once made it feel alive slowly disappears, leaving only routines pretending to be intimacy. This is why so many people become trapped inside dying relationships without recognizing what's happening. Human beings don't measure love through dramatic moments. They measure it through thousands of tiny emotional confirmations that happen without conscious thought. A lingering glance. Genuine curiosity. Shared excitement. The feeling that your existence still creates movement inside another person. Once those invisible confirmations begin disappearing, something inside you notices long before your conscious mind does. You become anxious without understanding why. You start trying harder without knowing what you're trying to recover. You become exhausted chasing something that no longer has a name. And that's when the quiet transformation begins. Instead of receiving affection naturally, you begin earning it. Every conversation feels like another opportunity to prove your importance. Every good moment feels temporary, as if you're borrowing happiness that no longer belongs to you. You start celebrating things that once happened effortlessly because they've become rare enough to feel like victories. What used to be normal suddenly feels like a reward, and without realizing it, you've accepted a relationship where emotional survival depends on occasional reassurance instead of consistent connection. The tragedy isn't simply that someone stopped loving you. The tragedy is that they often stop revealing it immediately. People rarely wake up one morning completely detached. Emotional withdrawal happens gradually. First they stop sharing parts of themselves. Then they stop imagining a future with you. Then they stop becoming emotionally affected by your presence. Eventually they stop feeling responsible for protecting the connection at all. None of these changes are loud enough to force confrontation. They happen quietly enough to preserve the appearance of normality while the relationship slowly empties from the inside. What makes this process even more devastating is your own mind. Instead of recognizing emotional withdrawal, it begins inventing explanations that protect hope. You assume they're tired. You assume work has become overwhelming. You assume they're struggling with something personal. Every explanation feels more comforting than accepting the possibility that their heart has already started walking away. Hope becomes a beautiful lie because it allows you to postpone grief. Unfortunately, every day you postpone accepting reality is another day spent loving someone who has already begun emotionally living without you. The strange thing about emotional distance is that it changes your personality before it changes your relationship. You become more cautious, more observant, more sensitive to tiny shifts in tone, expression, and attention. You replay conversations searching for hidden meanings that never mattered before. You begin monitoring emotional weather instead of simply existing inside love. Without noticing it, your nervous system becomes trained to anticipate loss before loss has officially arrived. And once that happens, even the happy moments become painful. When they smile at you, relief replaces joy. When they show affection, gratitude replaces comfort. You stop experiencing love directly because you're constantly measuring whether it's disappearing again. Every positive moment carries an expiration date. Instead of asking whether you're happy, you begin asking how long this version of them will last. The irony is that people often mistake this anxiety for becoming more loving. They believe they're fighting harder for the relationship when they're actually fighting harder against uncertainty. Love naturally creates security. Emotional withdrawal creates hypervigilance. Those two feelings are completely different, yet they often wear the same face from the outside. Someone watching you would think you're deeply committed. In reality, you're slowly adapting to emotional starvation. The person who has already begun leaving usually experiences something completely different. Because their detachment happened gradually, it doesn't feel dramatic anymore. They've already processed disappointments you haven't even discovered. They've already rehearsed life without you inside their imagination. While you're desperately trying to understand today's distance, they've quietly been adjusting to tomorrow's absence. That's why the final goodbye often feels calm to them and catastrophic to you. They're experiencing the ending after months of emotional preparation. You're experiencing it all at once. The most confusing part comes after you realize something is changing. You don't become colder. You become more available. Instinct tells you that if distance is growing, the answer must be more closeness. If conversations feel shorter, you try speaking longer. If affection feels weaker, you offer more of it. If they seem distracted, you become more attentive. Every action is driven by the belief that enough love can repair fading emotion. But emotional withdrawal rarely works that way. Once someone has started leaving internally, your increased effort often becomes invisible because they are no longer evaluating the relationship through the same emotional lens that you are. That is why people are often shocked when they hear, "Nothing changed overnight." They remember every sacrifice they made during those final months. They remember trying harder than ever. They remember becoming more patient, more understanding, more forgiving. From their perspective, they were giving the relationship its strongest version. From the other person's perspective, they had already stopped receiving those efforts with the same emotional weight. Two completely different realities existed under the same roof. One person believed they were rebuilding something. The other had quietly stopped imagining that it could ever be rebuilt. This is what makes emotional abandonment so difficult to recognize. It doesn't arrive as rejection. It arrives as indifference. And indifference is much harder to fight because it doesn't argue with you. It simply stops responding in the ways that once made you feel emotionally alive. You begin noticing that your excitement is no longer contagious. Your sadness no longer creates urgency. Your victories no longer become shared celebrations. The emotional bridge that once carried everything between two people begins collapsing one invisible piece at a time. Eventually, you start changing your own behavior without realizing why. You become quieter because enthusiasm no longer feels welcomed. You hesitate before expressing disappointment because it seems to create distance instead of understanding. You begin editing yourself, removing the parts that appear inconvenient, hoping that a smaller version of you will somehow be easier to love. This rarely happens consciously. It feels more like survival than sacrifice. You slowly become someone who asks for less because asking for more has stopped changing anything. There is a strange loneliness that exists only inside relationships where one person has already left emotionally. It is different from being physically alone because physical solitude has honesty. It asks nothing from you except acceptance. Emotional solitude inside a relationship is much crueler because it keeps offering the illusion that connection is still possible. Every ordinary day convinces you that tomorrow might feel different. Every small act of kindness becomes evidence that the person you remember is still there somewhere. You begin chasing fragments of who they used to be instead of accepting who they have quietly become. The mind struggles with this because human beings naturally trust consistency. We believe people remain emotionally similar to the versions we first fell in love with. When they change gradually, our memory fills the empty spaces with old expectations. We continue speaking to yesterday's version of them while today's version silently listens without the same emotional investment. That is why relationships can continue functioning long after they have stopped feeling alive. Habit is remarkably good at disguising emotional absence. One of the cruelest realities is that emotional withdrawal often changes what someone notices about you. The qualities that once fascinated them slowly become ordinary. The small imperfections they once found charming begin feeling exhausting. Familiarity doesn't always destroy attraction, but when emotional investment disappears, familiarity magnifies everything that no longer creates emotional reward. Nothing about you may have changed at all. The eyes looking at you simply no longer carry the same emotional meaning. This explains why the final weeks before someone leaves often feel so confusing. You become increasingly aware that something is missing, yet you cannot identify one catastrophic event responsible for the change. There is no betrayal dramatic enough to justify your growing emptiness. No single conversation explains the silence now living between ordinary words. The relationship begins feeling like a house where all the furniture remains exactly where it has always been, but somehow every room feels colder than you remember. Your instincts notice this long before your logic does. You begin paying attention to pauses that never mattered before. You recognize a different kind of eye contact. You sense that they are physically present while emotionally somewhere else. Their attention feels divided, not because another person has necessarily replaced you, but because the future inside their mind no longer automatically includes you. That realization is almost impossible to explain because nothing visible confirms it. Yet your body reacts as though it already knows. This is why so many people later describe the breakup as strangely predictable. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but they remember living with an unshakable feeling that something precious had already started disappearing. Looking back, they realized they weren't mourning the breakup itself. They had already been mourning the gradual disappearance of emotional closeness while convincing themselves it would somehow return. By the time the relationship officially ended, they were exhausted from carrying a grief they had never allowed themselves to name. The heartbreaking truth is that people almost never leave on the day they stop loving the relationship they once had. They leave on the day their emotional absence becomes impossible to hide any longer. The physical goodbye is simply the moment when reality finally catches up with emotions that have been changing in complete silence. And for the person who stayed emotionally present until the very end, that silence becomes the loudest memory of all. By the time someone finally says they're leaving, the sentence itself is almost irrelevant. The words hurt, but they are not what breaks you. What breaks you is the sudden realization that your heart has been reacting to this moment long before your mind was willing to acknowledge it. Every uneasy silence, every unanswered instinct, every evening that felt strangely empty despite someone sitting only a few feet away suddenly rearranges itself into a pattern you can no longer ignore. What once looked like isolated moments now forms a complete picture. You weren't imagining the distance. You were living inside it. That is why memory becomes so cruel after the ending. You don't only replay the final day. You revisit dozens of ordinary moments that never seemed important at the time. The dinner where they laughed a little less. The walk where conversation felt strangely forced. The quiet mornings when their eyes looked through you instead of at you. None of those moments felt significant enough to stop everything and ask, "Are you already leaving?" but together they become evidence that the goodbye began long before either of you admitted it. There is a painful difference between losing someone's presence and losing their emotional investment. Presence can be faked. A person can occupy the same room, follow the same routines, share the same life, and still be psychologically somewhere else entirely. Emotional investment cannot be faked forever. Eventually, curiosity disappears. The desire to understand you weakens. Your inner world stops feeling important to them. They no longer wonder what you're thinking because they have quietly stopped building a future that depends on knowing. Most people spend months blaming themselves for this shift because the human mind desperately wants a clear cause. It feels safer to believe, "I wasn't enough," than to accept that emotions sometimes fade so gradually that neither person notices the exact moment they begin disappearing. If there were one mistake, one argument, one obvious turning point, then at least the ending would make sense. But the hardest endings are rarely built on one decision. They are built on hundreds of invisible moments where two emotional worlds slowly stop moving in the same direction. Perhaps the most haunting realization comes much later, when you understand that the version of the relationship you spent so desperately trying to save no longer existed. You were protecting a memory while living in a reality that had already changed. Every effort was aimed at restoring something that had quietly disappeared months earlier. You weren't late because you failed to love enough. You were late because emotional departures do not announce themselves. They erase themselves slowly, allowing hope to survive just long enough to make acceptance almost impossible. And maybe that is why people who leave often appear strangely peaceful. It isn't because they never cared. It is because grief rarely begins on the day someone walks away. Their grieving started during the slow withdrawal, when they were already becoming emotionally absent while still physically present. They processed the ending in private, one unnoticed moment at a time. You, meanwhile, were still living inside the relationship as if it could return to what it once was. So when the final goodbye arrived, you inherited months of unprocessed loss in a single moment. Long after they are gone, what lingers is not the sound of the door closing. It is the unbearable question that refuses to leave your mind. When exactly did I stop living in the same relationship they were living in? There is no answer. No calendar date. No precise memory. Only the unsettling awareness that somewhere between ordinary mornings and familiar evenings, two people began sharing the same life while carrying completely different realities. That is what makes emotional departure one of the quietest tragedies a human being can experience. There is no explosion, no dramatic betrayal, no unmistakable ending. There is only a slow disappearance that disguises itself as routine until routine becomes emptiness. One person keeps reaching for a connection that still exists in memory. The other has already stopped reaching back, even if they haven't yet admitted it to themselves. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: almost every relationship has a final perfect day, but no one recognizes it while it's happening. There is a last genuine laugh, a last effortless conversation, a last moment where both hearts are fully present. It passes like every ordinary day before it, unnoticed because no one imagines it will never happen again. Only later do you realize that you were standing inside the ending while believing you were still somewhere in the middle. So when people say they left before leaving, they are describing something far deeper than physical absence. They are describing the moment a heart quietly stopped returning to the place where its body still remained. They are describing the invisible fracture that no photograph could capture and no conversation could fully explain. They are describing the strange loneliness of loving someone who had already begun existing without you, even while they were still close enough to touch. And that is the memory that follows you long after names fade and faces blur. Not the goodbye. Not the silence that came afterward. But the terrifying realization that the person you were trying so desperately to hold onto had already become a memory while they were still standing beside you. They didn't leave when they walked away. They simply let their body catch up to where their heart had already gone.